Okay, we're going to start off with a short little video. Actually, maybe I'll do that one first. Let's see.
I'm going to complain about that one. They don't give tickets out for 4 days straight, and the day that it's still cold, that's next to a snow, they come back. They're going to give you tickets. I didn't see. You have a lot of money there. That's why I had some.
Okay, do you guys know Khan from Khan Academy?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You've done maybe some of his videos or whatever. I thought I had it saved on my phone. So while shortly after the financial crisis was underway, he did this video interview. So right away when the crisis was hitting, he gave comments to CNN, and everybody was kind of wondering what was going on with the economy and the fall of Lehman Brothers. So a lot of the stuff we're doing in Allison, plus the stuff we're doing in this chapter, and he kind of put it in a nutshell on the fair market accounting, mark-to-market. So this is Khan, and he looks pretty young. So this was on October 28th of 2008. So it's the 2008 financial crisis. That's when the crap was really hitting the fan. I mean, the financial markets, everybody's wondering, what the outlook's going to look like. And so they went to Khan, and he's a super brilliant guy. I don't know, he's a genius guy. Seems to know a little bit about everything. So here we go.
Thanks for that report. We're going to talk to you, obviously, throughout the course of this newscast. I want to bring somebody in now that I'm really excited about having on this show. He's totally different from most of the people that we talked to. He gained his fame on YouTube, of all places, where people go to see how he explains things that most, frankly, don't understand. So let's start with the basics, Sal Khan. Thanks so much for being with us, for the Khan Academy, by the way. Basic question. Explain to our viewers, explain to the million people out there, what is actually broken that we need to fix.
Right. And right now we have so many, the stock market goes down every day, and people are having foreclosures, and banks are stopping lending, and they're failing. So it's really hard for people to keep track of what is the problem. Are these just causes of the problem, or are they the actual problem? So I think we need to take a step back, and I've drawn a little diagram here. Let's put it up. Draw a little diagram here, and I think there's a basic fundamental question that we all have to ask. And what does the financial system do? They make a lot of money. Hopefully, they add some value to our economy. And this diagram essentially explains what the financial system does. So, in a capitalist economy, you have a lot of people with capital. That could be land, that could be gold, that could be I don't know, animals, that could be cash, and what you need to do in order to make the economy grow is invest that capital into projects, build factories, plow seeds, hire people. And what the financial system does, the banks and the markets, they take that capital and hopefully they allocate it on projects that actually put people to work, hire people, grow our GDP. The problem right now is as opposed to the financial system actually putting more capital into the real world, it's, for the most part, more concerned with self-preservation at the moment. They're kind of in survival mode. And because they're in survival mode, you don't have this flow of capital going from whoever has it to the financial system and then to the projects. You would pretty much have everything just going back into the financial system because it's in essentially survival mode.
So, in the middle, why is that piece broken? Draw that one up for us.
Sure. And here I'm going to attempt to give everyone a 5-minute MBA. But essentially, what I've drawn here is our balance sheets for some banks. And it might sound like a complicated term, but a balance sheet is, I think, something that most people are fairly familiar with when they talk about home equity. So if I were to draw a balance sheet for someone's house, it would look something like this. So the asset would be your house, whatever it's worth. And then your liability, and I'll call that A for asset. And then your liability would be your mortgage. Your liability would be the loan. Now, if your house is worth $1 million, and your loan, let's say you owe $800,000 on your loan, whatever's left over is your equity. Well, that's a balance sheet. That's a balance sheet that I think most people are fairly familiar with. For corporations, they have the exact same notion. And I think this is an important point to realize when people talk about the stock market and what does it mean for a company's stock to go to zero. When you buy a stock in a company, you're not buying a share in all of its assets. You're buying a share in its equity. So if you look at, so I drew two banks here, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's broken, but a bank has assets and a bank has liabilities. And if you take the sum of the assets and you subtract out the liabilities, what's left over is essentially the equity. And when you buy a stock in a bank or any company, you're essentially taking a share of that. So what's broken here is through the housing bubble, a lot of these banks, in order to facilitate this whole securitization, and I can go more detail into that, what that is, they essentially accumulated these assets on their balance sheets. And this has been the central focus of the entire bailout plan. And there's been a lot of talk about toxic CDOs and what are they worth. But I just want to show you what they do to a bank's balance sheet and why it's so important that we figure out what these things are worth. Because you see here, I drew you can kind of do the height of this left-hand side is the assets, the height on the right-hand side is the liabilities. What's left over is the equity. If these toxic CDOs are worth nothing, if this disappeared, then all of a sudden, your assets are worth less than your liabilities. If your house is worth less than your mortgage, then you have no equity. In that situation, your stock would be worthless. And in that situation, there's no reason why anyone should be lending to you, because you're essentially throwing good money after that.
So essentially, the situation that the banks find themselves in is the same as the one that homeowners have found themselves in as a result of this.
Pretty much. Homeowners, you have an asset that's worth less than your liabilities. What do? Do you try to get someone to bail you out and buy your asset for more than it's worth, or do you just declare bankruptcy?
Let's hold off right there. We're going to come back in just a little bit. We're going to continue that conversation. And we're also going to be bringing you something today that's an exclusive to this particular hour on CNN. The story of Curveball. Who is Curveball? He may just be the only person that the Bush administration used as their source for going to war in Iraq, or certainly as much as anyone else. Was he right? No. Who is it? No one's known up to now. An exclusive interview with Curveball. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Yeah, I want to know about Curveball. You got me into that.
Here that comes. Finance S21, so many of you, 23,000, I believe, when we last checked, are talking to us, watching this newscast, as well as on MySpace and Facebook. In fact, there's somebody on MySpace right now. She's watching the show. She said, my son is 17 years old, excited about college. I'm worried that we won't be able to get a loan, sending my husband's hours have been back to work as well. It's absolutely affects all of America. And that's why we're doing what we're trying to do for you. Let's go back now and bring in Sal, if we can. Sal Khan. He explained to us moments ago what it is that is actually the problem, what it is that is broken. Now, let's take the next step. Let's try and understand, because everyone seems to be wondering, I don't understand this bailout/rescue plan that the government's been in. What is the government actually doing? Explain that to us so we can understand it like a fifth grader.
Right. So the main problem, just to take the big picture, was that no one's lending to each other. So what the government at least said that they wanted to do is try to get the lending started again. So their bailout plan is essentially, let's buy out these toxic CDOs. Because let's say I'm a good bank that didn't get involved in this. If Bank A is holding these toxic CDOs, I'm not sure.
Which would be BB&T with Allison's arguments, right? Be the good bank that didn't make bad loans or whatever.
Bank A should be bankrupt if the toxic CDOs are worth nothing, or maybe they are good for the money. So there's a lot of uncertainty on what these are worth. The government, at least what they said they would do, is if they went in and essentially did these reverse auctions and bought these assets, then that all of a sudden would give confidence in these banks. There wouldn't be uncertainty as to whether you could loan them money, and maybe that'll free up the credit, the whole system again. Will it work? Probably not. I mean, if you think about what's going to happen psychologically, so Bank A, if you were to, let's say that, if you were to just switch this toxic CDOs, and if you were to just turn that back into cash, because the government just bought it for exactly what Bank A says it's worth. So if you're just turning this into cash, the question is Bank A all of a sudden going to start lending? And there's a couple of things to think about, because besides that toxic CDO, there were other things on its balance sheet. And frankly, a lot of these things are starting to get a little bit toxic. No one's really talking about them right now, because if you have a dead skunk in your house, you're not going to notice that the milk's gone bad. So essentially, you have a lot of assets on your balance sheet right here that if you're a prudent bank manager, you're going to say, boy, I should just keep that cash, because if these turn toxic, because the economy might be turning south, or for whatever reason, I should just hold on to that cash so that I don't go bankrupt. So everyone is in complete survival mode, even the good banks. If somehow you were to give them capital, and the Paulson's new version of the plan is that essentially they'll inject equity, so buy stocks. If you buy a stock, you'll essentially make this pie bigger and put some cash here. But even this guy, the good bank, it's not so clear to me that he'll actually start lending. Everyone is in survival mode. This isn't a time to make new loans and take on new risks.
So it seems like the government went in and they decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go in here and help these guys out. As soon as we help them out, everybody will realize that now they have the government's backing, so other people will be interested in helping them. More people will give them their money. That hasn't worked. The people and other investors haven't bought into that. When we come back, I want to hear your idea of what perhaps the government should have done or could still do to rescue this. It's unique, it's different, and you and I talked about it earlier, but I want you to be able to share it with our viewers. Also, curveball. Story that we're talking about. This is going to be a CNN exclusive to this hour about one particular individual who no one has ever talked to before. He only speaks German and Arabic. You'll hear his conversation here in the next 10 minutes.
I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear his conversation. Yeah. Hey, the next time I'm done, look at my house and I took the show. See, Facebook was still around back.
So we understand that what actually is broken. We've got a sense of what the government tried to do to fix it, but it doesn't seem to be working because a lot of people, investors and regular folk.
I wanted to bring up, before we, just a few minutes left of this thing, so cash is king was kind of the mantra that turned out to be right. So back in the crisis, if you asked me what I thought was going to happen and when the government did these bailouts the way they did it, I would have said there's inflation coming. And I did say that inflation was coming, right? So it's effectively like printing off money by taking those toxic CDOs that they had, giving the banks cash. Now they were thinking that the bank would maybe go lend it out and that would help the economy recover. Had it shook out that way, then we would have got the inflation. But the story of the financial crisis, what really happened is what Khan just said, that cash is king. Let's keep cash. Let's not make more loans. Let's be sure that we're going to be able to pay our bills. We need to hunker down. And there's nothing like a big wall of cash to protect me from other things that might happen. And so that's what happened. And that's why the recovery was so slow that we didn't get inflation out of the crisis, because eventually that cash just kind of slowly milked its way out and we didn't get the inflation effect that we were predicting.
So are you saying that inflation effectively better in your opinion?
No, no. I think this actually turned out better. It showed how ineffective government bailouts were and how it caused more noise and uncertainty and a slow recovery. So I think the market had a better solution. People were smarter than the normal reactive thing. Like government policy kind of always worked that way. So the government bureaucrats are thinking, oh, the economy's down, just give them some cash. They'll loan it out. People will start spending again, and we'll be right back to normal. And certainly there'd be some sophisticated economic models that might show that, built on the assumption that the money actually goes out. But the safer thing to do was just to hang on to the cash and ride it out. And so I think that was a better solution. I think even my first best solution would have been to not bail out anybody, let them go bankrupt, let the investors lose money. Whoever placed a bad bet gets a bad bet. GM, General Motors, goes out of business and people lose their job, let them lose their job. And maybe that sounds harsh, but it's not really. We have other safety nets with unemployment insurance and other things. Don't bail out GM to keep those jobs when GM, unlike Ford, by the way, Ford was solid through it. So Ford was kind of the BB&T, if you will, of it. They were doing things right, and GM gets the bailout. As soon as GM goes bankrupt, they've got assets lying around, right? They've got a manufacturing plant. They've got workers that know how to build automobiles. How long would it have taken another company to say, oh, that looks like a profitable opportunity? We can pick up GM's assets, what's left of them, buy them off of GM, because that would be through the bankruptcy process, by the way. And whoever gets whatever the value of those assets were, those would be spread out among shareholders and other stakeholders with GM. And then a new automobile company would emerge, or a bigger Ford or a Toyota or whatever it is. Those assets wouldn't have gone unused. So I don't think any of these guys are too big to fail. I think a leave it alone approach would be better, but that's not what we continue to do. Bryce.
Okay, but now, like with the bailout of Fannie and Freddie, that was good though, wasn't it? Because it was already going back.
That's kind of a multiple layered thing there. So yes, the government needed to hold to what they had already agreed to with the Fannie and Freddie. So they were government backed. The bailout with Fannie and Freddie was them taking them over. So they didn't have to bail them out the way they did it with taking over Fannie and Freddie, because they thought they could just do it better and change some of the ways they were doing it. And then now it's back to being kind of somewhat, it's called a quasi-government entity because the government is so heavily involved with it that it's kind of hard to disentangle. So I think it's good that the government said that this is the way it worked, and it should work that way for most of that. But then actually, if Fannie and Freddie, owners of Fannie and Freddie, which were private people, that should have went under too. I think there would have been other ways to maintain the integrity of the government. You know, if they issue a bond, we need to pay the bondholders, whoever holds the bond, the interest payments. So, which is fundamentally different, and I think that's why you asked it, than the GM bailout. Like, we had no preconceived notions that we had to bail out any of these financial companies or GM, and those are the ones I would say just let them fail. And I think what would have happened, again, this is pure speculation, but as an economist, this is what I get to do, is we would have had a severe downturn, but I think the upturn would have came back a lot quicker. Instead, what happened during the Obama regime, not all due to Obama, by the way, it just so happened to remember he started in 2008, is we had this really flat, slow recovery. And so it looked like this, the unemployment rate stayed high. It's like, are we ever going to get out of this mess? It's, we're already in 2012 and we're still having lingering effects. Whereas if we would have just allowed people to fail, I think the rebound would have maybe come back in a normal time that recessions do, 6 months or something, and we would have been back in action. GDP growth and other things would have went on. And maybe most importantly, people would learn that the government's not going to bail them out, right? And that's kind of Allison's point here, is that we're better off with people making decisions based on the notion that they're not going to be bailed out. They're going to be a lot more careful. They're going to be a lot more efficient with their decisions if they do it that way. JC, Still have a comment or question?
During a financial crisis, the money you have in the bank is $700. That's to be safe. That you should be able to get that during a financial crisis.
In the United States, yes. We don't have any precedent where we lock down the money. In other countries, like if you go back to your hometown there in South Africa, you gotta be careful. So they do in Greece and other places where they've had a financial crisis, they will put capital controls on people's account and say that, yeah, you got 100,000, trust me, it's there, but you can't touch it right now. If you want it, you can't move it. So the most you can withdraw is 5% or 10%. They'll put some sort of maximum amount that you can draw on your account.
Your money is insured by the bank.
You mean in another country or in the United States? The United States, we got FDIC and you know, what we've kind of done with the Bankers Bank, with the Fed, and then also the FDIC insurance that's paying the premiums. So if you wanted to get your money, you could always get your money out. But in other countries, they don't have those, or the government is so backwards and upside down that they can't let people get the money because the money's not there. It's in some investment that went bad, and they're going to need time to recover it, right? So imagine those mortgages, if people aren't paying the bills, they have a house, if there's no money to bail out the particular company or bank, then they just have to wait. Like, well, hopefully that house will sell someday and the market will come back and it'll be back to being worth 400,000 when it's only worth 300,000 now. So let's not let people take money out of the bank is one way that they can help remain solvent with those capital controls, but not here in the United States.
So I understand why you're saying the bill after that in that situation. But what about like during like COVID stuff like that? Are these bailouts going to cause inflation?
Well, I guess what do you mean by a bailout? The assistance that we're giving?
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. You could call it kind of a bailout.
I guess some of these big companies that will be suffering, I don't know, line item being like airlines and stuff like that.
Yeah. You know, that's a great question. I tend to be pretty anti-bailout. So I would say let the chips fall where they may. The airlines that had a sufficient emergency fund are able to ride out COVID. Those that are running too thin of margins aren't. So guess who's crying to the politician for a bailout? It's the ones that are thin margins that aren't operating as efficiently. So it's very similar to the BB&T story, right? These bailouts are corrupting good business people that are actually making a good business decision based on poor government policy. Their business decision now includes the fact that, oh, the government's going to bail us out anyway, so we can draw down our cash reserves. We don't have to be as careful as we were in the past. See what I'm saying? So yeah, I'd say even with the COVID now, I am not. I would be up for COVID relief that is directed to those that were most vulnerable. If I don't want to get in a long, drawn-out COVID thing, but I'm not anti-government providing some safety nets out there. So I think some of the safety nets could be redesigned better, but to cut every American a check was stupid. I don't mind going on record. I've already had on podcasts and other things that just doesn't make sense. When we could have, you know, they gave me a check for whatever it was, $1,200 or something. I didn't need a check. I mean, I'm going to take it because I know my tax liability is going to go up in the future. But think of all the money that could have been dedicated to nursing homes and those facilities where you have the most vulnerable. Those are the people that needed to be really locked down, right? So let's give them all Netflix subscriptions, Hulu, and everybody gets a 50-inch flat screen and a lazy boy recliner. I mean, how much could you do with $1,200, right? If they would have taken my $1,200 and put it towards an 80-year-old in a nursing home, we can make their life comfortable as they stay locked down. We can be delivering some gourmet meals and some other things. You see what I'm saying? We could really have made a difference, but they kind of, you know, there is a little bit of an argument with expediency, but that's all based on the mindset that we just have to have people get spending money. So it's better to just get the money out, not worry about where it goes. I think that's BS. I think that's really weird.
Yeah.
Bryce.
Isn't that more likely to be inflationary than like the bank bailout because like the banks are just holding the cash or people are going to like spend it basically as soon as they need it?
Yes. Yeah, it is different that people are more likely going to spend it by putting it in their hands. And again, you're going to get some people think, well, that's the point. That's what we want to do. That'll help spur the economy. But you're right. I think it'd be likely more inflationary that way. The correction for that will be once they have to start sucking it. If inflation spikes up, then they have to start sucking that money out of the system again through the sale of bonds or whatever. That's going to affect the bond market. Now we get into interest rate talks. That interest rates are going to be, changing, going up from that action. So inflation and interest rates are going to be, I think, the talk of the town over the next year to 2 years for sure, related to the COVID relief stuff. I think
I would back especially a stat number like 20% of the money circulating today was printed in 2020.
No, I mean, but yes, here's where the fact check would be. If you look at the Fed's balance sheet on how much bailout they did. So the first package was what, 3 trillion or 4 trillion or whatever. Well, basically the Fed's balance sheet, the Fed bought all that money. And so you're right that the money went into the government hands, the government then dispersed it to the people or out into the form of money. And so now if you look at the amount of money out there, that 3 trillion as a I think M2, you guys might remember, it can help me out, wasn't M2 like about 12 trillion maybe or 13 trillion? So I think your number might be about right, Isaac, if they bought 3 trillion of bonds that basically injected 3 trillion into the system, and we have 13 trillion total, so 20% might have been somewhere out there. Yeah. Well, remember, we're talking about deposits and other things. All right, let's finish off this video. Just a few minutes left. I got this last issue that's good.
Don't seem to be buying into it. Let's bring in Sal Khan once again from the Khan Academy and talk about what may be done. Either A, would have been the original plan that would have worked a lot better, or something we can still do now. And that is.
So the big picture, just going back to the big picture, is that the financial system, no one's lending through, right? Every bailout plan so far, the government is just keeps injecting money in, either through loans, either through buying assets for maybe more than they're worth, or now buying stock. And the logic here is maybe that'll start up the lending. But most probably any new money that we put into the system, to a large degree, is just going to go into survival mode, or it's going to go to essentially make up mistakes that have already been made. So one idea, this actually came from a friend of mine, Todd Klutsky, and I actually think it sounded crazy when he first said it, but it actually sounds like a really good idea, is take that $700 billion, and remember, the problem isn't, you're not trying to save the financial system, you're trying to save the pipe that goes from the capital to the project. So why not take the $700 billion and capitalize a brand new financial system? And one thing that Todd had pointed out, $700 billion is an astronomical amount of money. That's more than the book value of the equity. Book equity is this piece right here on the balance sheet. The JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Washington Mutual, Wachovia, and Bank of America combined. So the government could overnight create banks bigger than those banks, although I don't think that they should concentrate it all in 5 or 6 banks. They should.
So in other words, you're saying, why try and put money into something that is so absolutely messed up? If they're half dead, let them die, create a new system altogether. But wouldn't that be a problem too? Because then wouldn't those banks be owned by the government? And we want that.
No, and this is the solution. And first of all, just to make a point clear, the solution involves government ownership. This plan, what you could do is the government could capitalize the banks, maybe 20 or 30 banks around the country, with the $700 billion, and then each of those banks could have 300 million shares, and they could give 1 share to every American.
New banks, totally new banks. Interesting. Sal, Khan, thanks so much. We'll keep you on. We're going to be talking about this throughout the hour, obviously. We're trying to get people to explain some of these things for us, and that's the market doing right now. Let's make that as big as we possibly can. Down 71, a lot better than we were looking at an hour ago. Maybe you helped, Sal. It's something. Hopefully. All right, we're going to come back to that in just a little bit. Obviously, one of the key stories that we're setting for you today.
So I don't like his solution. The idea is kind of interesting. You want to you're basically trying to bridge money, but I think if we had something like maybe we could come up with peer-to-peer lending through blockchain technology, which didn't exist in 2008, that's kind of what you want, right? If you could go from people who have money to investment projects and kind of have the intermediary of the banking system sidestepped a little bit, then that would be kind of cool. But of course, that hadn't even been innovated at that time. So not an easy solution with how to get projects. The bottom line is I don't think people really wanted to do investment projects at that point, right? I mean, you just have to kind of wait it out. So.
Curveball. And there seem to have been, including this one, let's go ahead and take it to it as fast as we can. This one comes in from Stan. Yeah, he watches this show a lot. Like today. He says, keep calm, talk at the basics. How are we being affected by what we're seeing in the news every day, the credit crunch, the situation with the market? Sure.
Yeah, just to color this in just a little bit, I tried to do it at the beginning. The sky is falling right now in the United States, right? I mean, which is almost funny. We go to a YouTube guy that's done these instructional videos, and he's just trying to answer why is this crisis happening, and what can we do? So it's kind of interesting that we go to them.
We know that everyone's going to unlever their debt, so we're going to have deleverage. That's essentially everyone unwinding their loans. Deleverage, and this is, I think, a critical point because I think there's been a lot of misinformation out there. That actually contracts the money supply. So a lot of people out there are worried about inflation, these deficits that lead to inflation. But when you have deleverage, and this is what happened in Japan, this is what happened in the 30s, the money supply contracts. That's our printing press. Leverage is our printing press, the fractional reserve system. And that's going to lead to deflation. So I think a lot of people are worried about, are we going to see inflation, are we going to see deflation? And if we don't fix the problem, we're going to see what Japan saw, and we're going to see deflation. And so,
and deflation means what concretely to me?
Things get cheaper, the opposite of inflation. So unfortunately, maybe salaries will go down, but on the plus side, a lot of assets, people buying a house, they'll get cheaper even. I know that probably won't be a good thing in the short term.
Yeah, exactly. Not with what the situation is right now. Thanks so much, Sam Conn. You've been a great guest. What an original way of being able to explain things.
Curveball. All right. Make sure to tune in to Curveball.
Who is this guy?
All right. Other questions from the video? So what I wanted to end with today is looking at the kind of the mark-to-market stuff, just to make sure you're clear and you got that in your notes on the difference between what's going on with banks and what goes on in kind of the real world. I like his little analogy that he did with the homeowners. So mark-to-market, this has been kind of standard accounting practice since 1993, and they tried to correct for the 80s problems. So if we look at the owner of a toy store, so the toy store assets, maybe they got some games, $1 million worth of games, dolls. They've got inventory of 500,000 dolls on hand. And they got some Legos of $500,000. So we add those all up. They've got $2 million worth of inventory, and they have some cash on hand of $500,000 in their accounts. So if we look at their assets, they're looking at $2.5 million. And then you got Mr. Banker over here from the bank, and they've got some assets like some bonds of $7 million and some stocks of $8 million and some mortgage-backed securities, the MBSs of $10 million. So we add all those up, and we've got $25 million worth of assets for the bank. Okay, so if we have a downturn in the economy, the bank is required to make some adjustments to mark their assets to market. Now, the toy store owner, what do they do if there's a downturn in the economy? Do the value of their games, dolls, and Legos go away? What are they likely to do with the downturn? They've got their assets there, inventory ready to sell. What are they going to do? What's their balance sheet doing? Not necessarily their balance sheet, but I mean, let's just think about them really riding out the storm. Are they incurring any losses on their balance sheet? Eddie? Go ahead, you can say whatever your comment
I was
was.
gonna say decrease prices.
Okay, yeah, they can decrease prices, try to respond if they need to, or they just kind of close down early and wait for the economy to come back. They can hold on to this inventory is kind of the point with that, right? So they have some flexibility. But if the lender, if we end up having a correction where the bonds now, the stock market crashed and that's worth 5 million, and this goes down to 5 million, and my mortgage-backed securities really go down to 5 million. Now my 25 million is down to 5. Even though initially at the beginning of the crisis, do we know for sure that these guys aren't going to pay their bills back, the mortgages? We don't know that for sure, right? We can ride out the storm again. But they don't allow that to happen the way the regulations are, that they have to make good and make some concessions, which might include calling in loans or not making loans in the first place, owners having to replace their equity. So for the toy store owner, they're not going to have to do those concessions in the same way the bank does. So that's the mark-to-market economy. So the key point here is that the loss is not realized. Let's put realized in quotes because that is kind of the accounting lingo. If assets are not sold. So, however, mark-to-market accounting rules force banks to adjust as if the loss occurred, as if they sold those mortgage-backed securities, even though they're holding on to it. So if they just hold on to these assets, the bonds come back, the stocks, whatever, they're just there, but they can't do that. All right, we'll see you tomorrow.